In the early hours of a morning that the maritime traffic maps of the Persian Gulf would record as the quietest in weeks, 3 Iranian-flagged oil tankers crossed the Strait of Hormuz in a staggered formation, sailing with their transponders turned off. The automatic identification systems that allow the tracking of any commercial vessel in real time. The plan was simple in conception and bold in execution: to cross the most heavily guarded corridor on the planet undetected, deliver crude oil to the Asian black market, and convert every barrel into revenue that American sanctions had promised to strangle. Tehran believed it had found the crack in the siege. In less than 90 minutes, it would discover that the crack was a trap. 90 minutes, the equivalent of the time it takes for a domestic flight to take off, reach cruising altitude, and begin its descent. In that interval, the United States Fifth Fleet, stationed in Bahrain, with the operational capacity to monitor every square meter of water between the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman, intercepted the 3 ships, seized approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil, a volume sufficient to supply all of New England for nearly a week, and transformed what Tehran had planned as an evasion operation into one of the largest maritime seizures of Iranian crude since the beginning of the maximum pressure sanctions regime. The estimated value of the cargo exceeded $160 million at the current price of Brent crude, and every cent of that amount represented oxygen that the regime of the Ayatollahs would not receive. And here was the paradox that the Iranian planners had not calculated. The very attempt to break the siege had provided the United States with the operational justification to tighten the blockade even further. Each seized tanker was not just a financial loss. It was a legal and military precedent that expanded the interdiction zone and reduced the margin of maneuver for the next attempt. Step back for a moment and look at the big picture. Iran was not trying to smuggle oil on a whim or out of expansionist ambition. It was trying to survive. The reimposed and progressively expanded sanctions had cut official Iranian oil exports from approximately 2.4 million barrels per day, the pre-sanctions level, to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 daily barrels in trackable channels, a drop of almost 80% that represented the amputation of the main revenue artery of a state whose economy depends on oil for more than 60% of its fiscal revenues. Internal inflation had crossed the 50% per year mark. The Iranian rial, the national currency, had lost more than 90% of its value against the dollar since 2018. Every barrel that did not reach the market was a hospital without imported medicine, a factory without replacement parts, one more month of pressure on a population of 88 million people already facing shortages of basic items. The equation had changed, but the true impact of this operation went far beyond the numbers on the naval battlefield. What the United States had demonstrated that morning was not just interception capability, it was logistical omniscience. The transponders were off. The routes had been altered. The tankers were sailing in windows of lower commercial satellite coverage. And yet, the Fifth Fleet knew exactly where they were going, and what they were carrying. This meant one of 2 things, and both were devastating for Tehran. Either American intelligence had penetrated the chain of command of the Iranian clandestine export operation, or the underwater and aerial surveillance systems in the strait had reached a degree of coverage that made any evasion attempt by turning off the transponder, the most elementary method of escape, completely useless. Soon you will understand why this distinction between the 2 hypotheses completely changes the nature of the problem for Iran. In the shadow of this monumental strategic error, there was an actor watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor that the headlines were not mentioning as frequently as the data deserved: Saudi Arabia. Every intercepted Iranian barrel was a barrel that did not reach the Asian market with a predatory discount, as Iran sold its clandestine crude at prices between $10 and $15 below Brent to compensate for the risk taken by the buyer. This practice directly eroded the Saudi market share in China and India, the 2 largest oil importers on the planet. With the seizure, Riyadh not only temporarily eliminated an unfair competitor, it gained political ammunition to pressure Washington to maintain and intensify the blockade. With each seized tanker, the strategic alignment between the United States and Saudi Arabia strengthened at the expense of Iran, in a dynamic that transformed each failed smuggling operation into geopolitical cement for the opposing coalition. The risk premium in the Strait of Hormuz, the additional cost that insurers charge any ship transiting the passage, had risen 40% in the weeks leading up to the interception, according to data from Lloyd's of London. This meant that every tanker crossing those waters paid hundreds of thousands of dollars more in insurance, a cost that was passed on to the final price of the barrel and that ultimately reached the pockets of consumers at gas stations from Tokyo to Frankfurt. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 21 million barrels pass every day, about 21% of all global oil consumption, had become not just a logistical bottleneck, but a real-time thermometer of global geopolitical instability. This is not just a matter of territory on the map. It is a matter of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. Think carefully about what this number represents in practice. 21 million daily barrels passing through a corridor, only 34 miles wide at its narrowest point, less than the distance between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. If that corridor were blocked for just 72 hours, the barrel of oil could jump past $200, according to modeling by Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, which would trigger an energy crisis capable of pushing the global economy into recession in a matter of weeks. And it was precisely this vulnerability that Iran had used as a bargaining chip for decades, the implicit threat that, if pushed too hard, it could close Hormuz and drag the world down with it. The interception that morning had demonstrated that the United States was willing to call the bluff and had the operational capacity to do so. But there was a layer we had not yet touched upon, and it completely changes the nature of this analysis. General Robert Hayes, Commander-in-Chief of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, a man in his early 60s known for incendiary speeches at military ceremonies and for personally overseeing the clandestine export network that funded the operations of the IRGC, the most powerful military branch of the regime, responsible for both external defense and the control of vast economic empires within Iran, had classified the evasion operation as a top-tier strategic priority. This general is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate of what the regime consumes when it bets everything on one operation and loses not just barrels and dollars, but internal credibility before the armed forces he commands and the power structure he represents. The historical analogy that most accurately captures this dynamic is not the naval blockade of Cuba in 1962, although the temptation to compare them is obvious. It is Napoleon's continental blockade against England at the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon tried to strangle the British economy by banning European trade with the islands. The result was the opposite. England found alternative routes, strengthened its navy, and the blockade eroded the cohesion of Napoleon's allies, who depended on British trade as much as England depended on the European market. Likewise, the sanctions and interdictions against Iran were producing a paradoxical dual effect. They weakened the Iranian economy, yes, but simultaneously pushed Tehran into an ever deeper dependence on China, the only buyer with the volume and political willingness to absorb Iranian crude under the risk of secondary sanctions. And every barrel bought by China with a $15 discount was a barrel that strengthened Beijing's position as the energy arbiter of Asia, reducing the bargaining power of both Washington and Riyadh in the long run. And the greatest paradox of the entire crisis was precisely here. The weapon the regime had launched to wound the enemy was, at that moment, destroying its own source of income. Every failed smuggling attempt not only resulted in a direct loss, the seized barrels, the confiscated ships, the detained captains, but raised the cost of the next attempt. Crews demanded higher pay for the risk. Black market insurers raised rates. The middlemen operating the clandestine network between Tehran and Chinese ports charged higher commissions. The operational cost of exporting a clandestine barrel had tripled in 18 months. According to industry analyst estimates compiled by the Financial Times, eroding the already thin profit margin the regime could extract from each shipment that actually reached its destination. And here was what that layer revealed. Iran was not just losing a naval battle. It was losing the economic war of attrition that sustained its ability to project regional power. Without sufficient oil revenue, funding for Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen and Shia militias in Iraq, the so-called proxies, allied armed groups that Iran arms, funds and guides as an extension of its regional strategy, became progressively compromised. Estimates from the International Institute for Strategic Studies indicated that Iran allocated between $700 million and $1 billion a year to this network of proxies. Each seizure in the Gulf was, therefore, a direct cut to the Iranian asymmetric warfare budget. The strategy of fighting more powerful enemies, not with conventional armies, but with dispersed allies and indirect operations. Russia cannot sustain this bleeding indefinitely, and the end of this period will determine the future not of one country, but of all of Europe. And the same logic applied to Iran in the Persian Gulf, with one crucial difference. While Russia had natural gas reserves and a partially captive European energy market, Iran depended almost exclusively on oil and faced a blockade that grew more sophisticated every quarter. And then we arrive at the question that no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. If American interdiction capability in the Strait had reached the level demonstrated that morning, interception of ships without transponders, on altered routes, in low commercial coverage windows, then the distinction between the two previously mentioned hypotheses became practically irrelevant. Chain of command penetration or technological omniscience both produced the same operational result. Iran had no safe corridor. Every barrel leaving Karg Island, the main Iranian export terminal, sailed under surveillance that Tehran could not neutralize, bypass, or even map accurately. The siege had not been broken. It had proven to be tighter than any strategist in Tehran assumed. Every additional day was one more day of pressure on the countries that most needed that resource, and which would put pressure on Washington that the White House sooner or later would not be able to ignore. Because the blockade also had a cost for those blockading. Maintaining a permanent interdiction fleet in the Gulf cost the United States approximately $15 million a day in naval operations, and the volatility in oil prices generated by the tension directly affected the American electorate at the gas pumps, a variable that no president in an election year could ignore indefinitely. What that morning in the Strait of Hormuz had established was not the end of the Iranian attempt to export oil under sanctions. It was the beginning of a new phase in which each clandestine barrel would cost more to leave, yield less upon arrival, and further strengthen the adversaries of Iran with each failure. The emerging question was not whether Tehran would try again. It would, because it had no viable economic alternative, but how long the regime could sustain a strategy whose execution cost rose exponentially while the revenue per delivered barrel fell proportionally, and whether Beijing, the only remaining relevant buyer, would decide that the Iranian discount no longer compensated for the risk of American secondary sanctions. The chessboard had been flipped, and the pieces left to Iran were fewer and fewer in an increasingly expensive game. If this topic matters to you as much as the data suggests it should, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this crisis in the Gulf could rewrite the energy map of the world. And when that happens, you will want to understand every move before the headlines simplify it.